I'm so excited to bring you guys my friend Phyllis Kiser, who I've known for a little over a year now. And Phyllis, I'm so happy that we were able to make this work. And thank you so much for giving us a little bit of your time.
Glad to.
Phyllis has been in counseling for over the last 10 years and practices at Stonegate Counseling in Watkinsville. And Phyllis, you and I were talking earlier. We've been walking through the last 5-6 weeks, almost 2 months now, of just so much change in our personal lives, in the lives of our family, in the life of our work, whatever we call that, in our daily routine. And we've just been going through so much loss along the way with that change. And you and I were talking about really the word for those things, to kind of put some language around it, would be we're going through a lot of grief right now and a lot of opportunities to grieve things that we're losing. So as we have lost things like family vacations or birthday plans or income, I mean, even some of these everyday things that were on our calendar and now they're not, that in a sense, under the surface, maybe we're experiencing grief, whereas on the surface, we may just think, oh, that's a huge bummer. I'm sad I'm not going to get to go on my spring break trip. But under the surface, there's some grief there that needs to be probably paid attention to.
Absolutely. I think a lot of times people associate grief with death.
Yeah.
And I think it's much broader than that. And in this season of quarantine, this season of pandemic, this season of uncertainty and ambiguity, that the losses just continue to pile up. From little things, just that loss of routine, or the inability to get a haircut, or take your kids to the park, or be with your friends, or whatever, those things that are so precious. They've gone missing. We don't have the ability to do that. And then big things too, like some have lost people very close to them. And in this pandemic, we've lost the ability to participate in ordinary grief processes, like going to funerals and wakes and that kind of thing. And so that just makes that sense of loss just so heavy for so many people.
That's interesting. So you're seeing, kind of in your position as you still talk with clients and have conversations with people, that it's not just we're experiencing a bunch of change and loss in everyday life. We also are losing what we have known to be the systems and processes in our society to help us grieve.
Right.
Like to go to funerals and to actually see family and things that people, maybe their presence is comforting to us in the middle of loss. We can't really do that right now.
Right. I mean, I think our sense of belonging in community is greatly affected and impacted by the quarantine. And God designed us to need community. He lives in community, His Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He plants us in community, in families, in churches, and small groups, and work environments.
Right.
We are connectional people. And when we don't get to participate in those connectional processes, it's a big hit to our spirit and our soul. It really is.
And another thing I've heard from people who I'm in small group with, and friends of mine, is right now, especially this time of year, there's so many life events that bring about closure, especially if you have students, whether in any grade, but especially high school and college. And has that popped up in any of your conversations as well?
Oh, absolutely. Those rites of passage that we wait for, we look forward to, those expectations that we have.
Yeah.
Are up in smoke right now. Weddings, people are coming up, they're having to reschedule their weddings, or they're completely reworking how they're going to do their wedding and from a social distancing
Mm-hmm.
perspective. That's another rite of passage, that you get married and you have your family and your friends together, and reception and food, that community experience that people have lost in this pandemic.
So how are you seeing, as people experience this tons and tons of loss, how are you seeing people respond to that? Because you and I were talking a little earlier, we have the opportunity to respond, but a lot of times we maybe either don't realize it or we don't respond in the right way. So how are you seeing people respond to this change, this loss, the opportunities to grieve? How's that playing out for you?
Well, a lot of different ways for people. I think there's a lot of numbing out.
Mm-hmm.
We're watching a lot of Netflix, and as we talked about earlier, with no sports, we've got things like Tiger King and that kind of things that entertain us. I think just seeing people feeling depressed and anxious.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing people who are feeling really angry.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that anger, it's valid. It might not be the primary emotion. Maybe underneath that anger, if we could excavate that anger, we might run into that sadness and grief and loss,
mm-hmm.
disappointment and fear. Just so much fear that people are really grappling with right now. And so a lot of relational issues. This is a really hard season for married people. It's a hard season for families with school-age kids, where you're it's not homeschooling, it's crisis schooling, right?
Yeah.
Or your college kids are home and you're used to them being away, and just that extra time that couples spend together. Maybe your space is tight, and you don't. And that's where we really miss those routines and those structures that help things feel normal to us.
What happens when these emotions and maybe this discomfort or uncomfortableness kind of starts to well up in us? What happens if we just ignore that and the walls in our house are getting smaller and smaller, or we every day feel a growing sense of tension somewhere with somebody or even within ourselves? What happens if we choose to ignore those things instead of chasing those out to figure out where they're coming from?
Well, I mean, obviously we don't always have good outcomes.
Yeah.
And I think, our bodies take a toll. Like if we keep this soul, spirit, mental, emotional process sort of locked inside, I think it takes a toll on our bodies. And I think we're seeing a lot of, if you have a chronic pain issue, maybe that's flared up. If you've got a bad back, maybe your bad back is flared up. Just that sense of feeling stir crazy that people talk about, that, being sort of trapped. And we like freedom. As Americans, we're used to freedom, that freedom to move about and do the things that we want to do. And so it's disorienting. I think that sense of disequilibrium, where we're just chronically out of balance, right now is disturbing to us. So I think talking about it, putting a word on it, being aware of it, that, wow, this is what I'm experiencing, and that's okay.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic for people maybe who are listening to this, who are hearing you tick off these different emotions or these different scenarios in our everyday life right now, to be able to say, oh, wow, maybe the thing I am feeling, maybe that tension I am feeling is I actually have a ton of unpaid or non-paid attention to grief that's under the surface of my life. I need to actually pay attention to that. Something you've told me in the past is that grief is actually not optional. that we don't have the option to grieve or not grieve. Either we can proactively grieve in healthy ways, or it's going to find us and come out sideways.
That's right. That's exactly right. I think the choice is to lament.
Mm.
And so that's an active way to experience and process that profound loss and that sense of grief. And if you had sort of some unresolved grief, and I mentioned to you that my mom passed away last fall, and I'm in this grief share group trying to process that grief, and I'm just sort of getting my feet wet in it, that the grief and loss that I'm experiencing because of quarantine and pandemic, it's really bumping into, some of that unprocessed grief from my mom's passing. So if you've got, and we grieve lots of things, it could be a broken marriage or a relationship with a child that is, there's cut off, or there's such brokenness that you can't be in relationship, that all this grief, it just begins to bump into each other, and further contributes to that sense of disequilibrium and feeling disoriented, and maybe all those emotions, really show up. Or we really bury it, we push it down and pretend like it's not really bothering us.
Which definitely tends to be my go-to.
Yeah, me too.
As you and I have talked about over the past year, it's definitely my go-to. It's the easiest, it's the path of least resistance, it feels like.
Well, and it may be familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned the word lament, and how lamenting things that you lose can be a way you actively grieve. That's not a vocabulary word that a lot of us use every day. Could you just expand a little bit on what does it mean to lament something? What does lamenting look like? Kind of how, from your experience, how would you explain that?
It's a process where you allow yourself, you give yourself permission to grieve, to suffer the losses. And we don't like to suffer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a way, it's allowing yourself space to be sad, or to be angry, or to be upset, or to be frustrated, and to allow yourself to feel the pain in order to get through the pain. Is that a way to explain it? For sure.
Absolutely. And while grieving is not optional, lamenting is. And it's, I think, one way that we can choose to lament is by creating a rhythm of grief and lament in our life, because losses are ongoing.
So what do you mean?
Part of self-care,
Yeah. What might be an example of here's a rhythm of actually grief that you can put into practice in your life? What would that look like for somebody, you think?
Periodically taking some time just to sit down and maybe write out, here's some of the things that I've lost this quarter, this month, this year, this season of life, and take note of the feelings, express those feelings. My favorite way to do that is by getting into the Psalms. Because the psalmist often laments and cries out all the stuff, the ugly stuff, to God. And then the psalmist comes back and says, but I trust in you. You hear my cry for mercy. You're my hiding place.
Right.
I can run to you with this deep sense of loss and this hurt and this pain and this suffering. So I think the Psalms are a really great way to lament and process all the things, the big emotions, the little emotions, even understand some of what we've lost, because sometimes we don't really understand what it is. We just might just have that sense of sadness or grief.
Yeah. and you actually shared a really helpful article with me about where someone has taken the Psalms and kind of categorized them in different emotional categories, and how whatever you're feeling, there's a list of Psalms you can actually go to, and it really does give you language around whatever it is you're feeling. And there's people who through centuries and thousands of years throughout the history of the church have literally prayed these prayers of the Psalms word for word as a way to kind of get through, because you and I talked before that grief, you do actually get through it. That is something you do get through, which is really hopeful. I want to kind of land the plane on this, because I think so many times we talk about grief, or we hear people talk about grief, and it doesn't feel very hopeful. It's something that we just associate with sadness and with maybe a little bit of loneliness. I got to do it by myself, on my own, that kind of thing. But Jesus is actually somebody that we can look to for an anchor in the middle of our grief. Talk a little bit about that. Like, how is Jesus connected to our grief personally and the way we grieve?
Yeah, Jesus, as Christ followers, we know that we have a high priest who experienced grief and loss and suffering. Mm-hmm. So to know the heart of God, we see God's heart in the face of Christ on the cross. Mm-hmm. He suffered for us, but not just for us. He enters into our suffering with us. That we don't suffer alone. And Isaiah tells us that Jesus is a man who was acquainted with sorrow and grief.
Yeah.
Yeah, that he's the suffering servant. And so we have that opportunity and that privilege to invite him into our loss and our grief and our lamenting, and know that he is with us, our pain and our suffering and our sorrow and our lamenting.
Yeah, and he's not afraid of it either.
No.
Yeah.
And he's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so he's in our past, present, and future losses and grief with us always.
Yeah.
And to me, there's more hope in that.
Absolutely. I mean, to know that I can identify all the change and loss I've experienced in the last 2 months. I can actually invite Jesus into that and say, you know what this feels like, to feel what a death feels like, whether it's a literal physical death or the death of a dream or the death of something that you had planned on or whatever it is, or the death of my finances or my income, that I don't have to actually experience that alone, but I can invite Jesus in, who knows what that feeling is and can carry me through it. For somebody watching or listening today, I think that's an incredibly hopeful thing to hear. Well, Phyllis, this has been so incredibly helpful. And also just thank you for pointing us to Jesus in the middle of this as well.
That's awesome. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, I appreciate you, of course, being a part of this, and we will talk to you soon.
A great privilege. Thanks. God bless you.